So we're going to begin with an introduction to biological sciences. We're going to go through some basic principles. This is a list of the learning objectives that we will cover in this lecture. So to begin, what is biology? If we break down the word bio and ology, bio refers to life. Ology is the study of. So biology is the study of life, or the study of living organisms. What is an independent unit of life? An independent unit of life is called a cell, C-E-L-L. And cells come in all different shapes and varieties. You can see some pictures here of different cell types. Where did life come from? So simple precursor chemicals are present in a watery environment or in a soup. Those precursor chemicals react to form small organic molecules. Those join together to form polymers. Genetic material encodes proteins, lipids form spheres, and then you have the formation of a protocell, a self-replicating system that's enclosed in a membrane. Once you have a cell, now you have life. The first cells lived without oxygen, so you can see when carbon dioxide was found in the environment and prevalent, and then when oxygen started to take over. So about 4 billion years ago is when we estimate that the first living organism came to be, and then those first living organisms were completely dependent on sources other than oxygen for energy production. Their growth was slow, and it took a long time before they started to develop these organisms that were photosynthetic and could use sunlight and convert carbon dioxide into sugar, and then later break down that sugar for energy production. Throughout that process, they started giving off oxygen as a waste product. So now you start to see oxygen appear in the environment about 2 billion years ago. When oxygen is present, it allows for energy to be produced in a much bigger way, in a much larger quantities. So with greater energy comes greater possibilities, and now you see a huge diversification of the types of organisms that were found on the Earth, eventually leading to all of the different 5 kingdoms that you've likely heard of, Animalia, fungi, plantae, Protista, and then Monera, which includes Archaea and bacteria. And as I mentioned, eventually organisms that evolved to use water during photosynthesis produced oxygen as a byproduct. And that's when you started to have the increase in diversity of life. Life is organized. So how do we organize life? Well, we have to break everything down into its pieces in order to define those pieces and organize those pieces. So we start with the basic level of organization, and that's the atom. From the previous module, you should have learned a little bit about chemistry and about what atoms are. So atoms are the smallest chemical unit of a type of pure substance or an element. So an example would be a carbon atom. In other words, an atom is a building block of matter. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So everything around us on Earth has mass and takes up space. And all of this matter is made up of these little tiny building blocks called atoms. Atoms can come together to form molecules. So what molecules are just a group of joined atoms. An example of a molecule is DNA. Also H2O, or water. Water is a molecule. All matter, living and non-living, is composed of molecules. The next highest level of organization is an organelle. So we talked briefly about a cell and how a cell is an individual unit of life. Cells contain organelles, and organelles are like the functional components within the cell. If you picture a cell like a 3-bedroom apartment or a 3-bedroom house, the cell itself is the house, but inside of the house you have all different rooms. So let's say you have an exercise room, or you have a kitchen, or you have a laundry room. So each one of those compartments inside of the house has a specialized function. That's kind of what an organelle is. An organelle is a membrane-bound structure that has a specific function within a cell. The example given here is a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are found in plants. But each cell itself has different types of organelles. Chloroplasts can also be found in algae. Some cells, but not all cells, are composed of organelles. We'll learn a little bit more about organelles and their functions as we go through here. So the cell. So I've mentioned cell a couple times. The cell is the fundamental unit of life. An example is a leaf cell. All life is composed of cells, although some cells do not have organelles. So how do we even come to the word cell, and where do cells, how do we even know about them? Well, way back when, a scientist named Robert Hooke had a single lens similar to a magnifying glass and decided to look at a small sliver of cork material under that magnifying glass. The cork material came from a plant, so cork is plant, and plant cells are known to be rectangular or square-shaped. They have a definitive shape due to the structure of their cell wall or their outer layer of their cell. So when he looked at this, he said, wow, it kind of looks like a prison cell. And that's how cells got their name way back when. Today, we just know cells as being the single unit of life, an independent unit of life. Cells are so important because cells can be an organism in and of themselves, or cells can come together to create an organism. So I'll give you an example. A bacterial cell. Bacteria, those little germs that can make us sick, those are one individual cell is considered one organism. And each one of those cells is its own independent organism and functions as an organism. But with people are made up of multiple cells. Tons and tons of cells come together to create our tissues and our different components. So cells, in the case of people, we are multicellular. We need multiple cells in order to come together to create a person. So if the organism is multicellular and it's not a unicellular organism, then those cells can come together to form tissues. Tissues are a collection of specialized cells that function in a coordinated fashion. For example, the epidermis of the leaf, or the outer layer of the leaf. And you can see all of the cells that are together. Within tissues, you typically have cells of similar type, so they kind of look alike, and they're going to work together to perform a coordinated function. The next level of organization would be the organ. So tissues come together to form organs. An organ is a structure consisting of tissues organized to interact and carry out specific functions. So for example, a leaf. The difference between an organ and a tissue is that tissues consist of multiple cells that work together to produce a particular function, while organs consist of multiple tissues that come together to produce a particular function. So within an organ, you typically have different tissue types. Organs come together to create an organ system. So an organ system is when organs connected physically or chemically that function together. For example, an above ground part of a plant, that would be considered an organ system. If we're talking about people, an organ would be the heart. An organ system would be the cardiovascular system. So cardio referring to the heart, vascular referring to the blood vessels. So heart and blood vessels are the organs of the cardiovascular organ system. So organ systems, you have multiple organs that come together to provide a particular function or work together toward that function. Then you have the entire organism. An organism is a single living individual. As I mentioned previously, an organism can be single-celled, or just consist of one cell, or multicellular and consist of multiple cells. If an organism is single-celled, you're not going to see tissues, organs, and organ systems within them because they're just one cell. The one cell is just going to have organelles inside of it. And those organelles are going to be consisting of molecules, and those molecules consist of atoms. So you're kind of at the lower level of organization here. But we also have multicellular organisms, and multicellular organisms have multiple cells, and those are going to have the different tissues and organs and organ systems that come together. But we don't stop at the organism. In the field of biology, we tend to look at life as a whole. So every living thing on Earth, even the interactions with the living things and the non-living components on Earth. So if we keep going up the chain here and keep going up into higher levels of classification, we get to the population. A population is a group of the same species of organism living in the same place and time. So an example would be multiple acacia trees. Here you can see the acacia trees clumped together. We can also see a population of people. So if we have a particular city and we want to know the population of it, we count how many people are in that city. If we want to know the population of koala in a particular part of Australia, we can count all of the koala in that area. So we're talking about the number of the same species that are living in a particular area. Moving up from population, we can come to community. A community is all the populations that occupy the same region. For example, all populations in a savanna. Now we're talking about all of the living populations within a particular area. So here you can see a picture of the savanna. So you have trees, a population of trees, a population of grass, and a population of elephants in this picture. So all of those populations come together to create a community. An ecosystem is the living and non-living components of an area and the interactions between those living and non-living components. So now we're not only talking about the plants and animals that are living there, the bacteria, fungi, the living organisms, but we're also talking about the non-living components like the rocks and climate, the minerals that are found in the soil, things that are considered non-living. So an ecosystem is the living and non-living components within a particular area. The biosphere is considered the global ecosystem, the parts of the planet and its atmosphere where life is possible. So that concludes our levels of organization. So we start at the atom and we kind of work our way all the way up to the most broad category of organization, and that's the biosphere. In the field of biology, there are subdisciplines that kind of focus on each one of those individual areas. Once we get later on in this module, we are going to go through all of the different subdisciplines of biology, and you'll see how many possibilities and how many career pathways there actually exist in the field of biology. So going back to this idea of the cell. So cells, we talked about, those are individual units of life. With the cell, there are two major categories of cellular organisms. We have prokaryotes and eukaryotes. This division is important because prokaryotes are suspected to be the first to evolve in the evolutionary timeline. So these are the oldest organisms. We call them prokaryotes because these developed before an organelle that we call the nucleus developed. I'm sure you're familiar with the term DNA. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, that's the directions, and that contains all of the instructions for how to make a cell its unique self. So how to make all of the proteins inside of a cell and what makes an individual organism unique. DNA is housed inside of a nucleus if it's a eukaryote, but DNA is just in the center of the cell if it's a prokaryote. So that's one of the major distinguishing factors between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. There are some other distinguishing factors, which I'm going to briefly mention here. But when we say prokaryote, prokaryotes we're referring to the bacteria and Archaea. I'm sure you've heard of bacteria before. Bacteria like E. coli, Salmonella, strep, like strep throat, staph, if you get staph infections. Those bacteria are single-celled organisms, And they're very simple in structure. They're prokaryotes. So they have their genetic material. They have these little organelles called ribosomes, which are going to help them make proteins. And then they have an outer boundary. And there's several other components that we don't need to go into in this level of class, but there are different types of components to the cell. But the main thing about bacteria is that they do not have a nucleus, and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. So no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. And they were one of the first organisms to exist. Archaea, which is something that you probably haven't heard of before, and that's predominantly because they don't really interact with people directly too much, and they don't really cause human disease. So archaea are going to live in extreme environments. These organisms are really tough, and they're in these environments that they don't have a lot of competition in. They can survive in extreme temperature changes, in extreme salt concentrations, in extreme pH levels. So they can live where there's a lot of base or a lot of acid in the environment. They can live in lava flows. So these things have adapted so that there's not a lot of competition and they get any nutrients that are in that environment. However, they have to struggle to survive in that harsh environment. So bacteria and archaea are both considered prokaryotes. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. These evolved a little bit later on. Examples of eukaryotes include animals, and I'm going to write these down such as they're labeled with the kingdoms. So Animalia, Plantae, the plants, fungi, which is fungus, and Protista. So Animalia, we're talking about animals, and animals include organisms that live in the ocean. It includes insects, so multicellular, heterotroph, which means that they eat other organisms to survive. That's what we're referring to with Animalia. Plantae, we're talking about plants. So these organisms are going to have roots, and they're going to undergo photosynthesis in order to make their own food source, so then they can use their own food source in order to make energy. Fungi is referring to the yeasts and molds, and those are going to be our decomposers. So fungi are going to break down other living organisms that have died. And Protista, with Protista we're talking about algae or protozoa. Algae are going to be photosynthetic. Protozoa are like animal-like, except they're all unicellular. A lot of protozoa can cause some pretty wicked diseases in people. An example, if you've ever heard of the brain-eating amoeba, that's when you go swimming in warm, natural bodies of water. Those things can get up your nose while you're splashing around. They can get into your brain and cause a whole bunch of damage, including death. There's also Giardia, which is a pretty common cause of traveler's diarrhea. Giardia, if you consume water that's contaminated, it causes some pretty serious diarrhea. But there's all sorts of different types of protozoa that cause infections. The common thing is that they are all unicellular. So that's just an overview and kind of idea of the difference between prokaryotic organisms and eukaryotic organisms. At the end of this module, you will have to take a test. So you should take some notes on the major differences. So remember, prokaryotes, they don't have a nucleus and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes do. Prokaryotes include bacteria and archaea, while eukaryotes include Protista, fungi, Animalia, and Plantae. So we used to have this 5-kingdom system, and I did just reference the kingdoms, so Animalia, Plantae, fungi, Protista, and Monera. But recently, after doing some rRNA typing, so ribosomal RNA typing, we started to get sequences that allowed us to determine where organisms may have diverged into new species, just based on looking at their RNA. And getting these sequences with this new technology, we have now adopted a 3-domain system. So these are the 3 domains of life. Bacteria, Archaea, and Eukaryota. Eukaryota can also be called Eukarya. If you look at this picture, you can see where life began at the bottom here. Bacteria branch off to the left, and then you have Archaea branch off first on their path to eukaryotes. We talked about how bacteria and Archaea are prokaryotes. And eukaryota are eukaryotes. So you can see that Archaea are actually more closely related to the eukaryotes than they are to the bacteria. However, they are still considered prokaryotes, and they're considered prokaryotes because they do not have that nucleus, nor do they have membrane-bound organelles. All of the prokaryotes are single-celled or unicellular, which means that they, as an organism, it's just one cell that makes up that organism. Eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular depending. So there's some eukaryotes that are just single-celled or unicellular, and there's other eukaryotes that are multicellular. But those are the main differences, and now you have an idea about the 3 domains.